First up, we're going to have Samantha Lawrence. So Samantha was a fellow from 2012 to 2015. She did material science and engineering at Purdue University. She did practicums at Sandia, both at the California site and the New Mexico site. And she joined the lab in 2015 and is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Sandia in a group that studies the interactions of hydrogen with hydrogen storage and on the effects of hydrogen storage on metals. So, Samantha?
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction. So I've never given a talk like this before, but I was really excited to be asked by Lucille and the folks at Krell to give this kind of talk. So you'll have to bear with me as I go through these couple of slides. But I'm really excited to share some of my experiences as a postdoc and how being an SSGF fellow impacted those experiences. So as Tracy said, I'm a postdoc in the Hydrogen Effects on Materials Laboratory at Sandia, California. So I'm going to start by just giving you some kind of general information on, on being a postdoc at a national lab. Some of you may be asking, as you're looking at your next step after grad school, much like I did, what the heck is a postdoc at a national lab? And really simply put, I would say postdocs are the lifeblood of the national labs because you are by far the cheapest qualified technical staff on the site. That does not mean that you're the lowest paid. In fact, postdocs at national labs are very well compensated. But it does mean that you have a very low burden rate. So your time is much less expensive than that of a technical staff member, which really allows you a lot of freedom to do high-impact science, to maybe travel down a rabbit hole that's a little tangential to your project, but is very interesting to you and your group, but that a technical staff member would have neither the time nor the funding to pay for their time to cover to answer those types of questions. So use that to your advantage if you decide to be a postdoc at a national lab. So kind of in that same vein, I'd like to go through some of the types of funding that you might encounter at a national lab and how that can impact a postdoc experience. So the way I see it, there's kind of three subcategories of funding. The first is going to be programmatic funding. At the 4 defense labs, that's money that's going to come from DOE NNSA to fund nuclear weapons-based projects. At Sandia, California, we have a particular interest in GTS. So I'll throw out our first acronym, gas transfer systems. So we get GTS as one of our major customers in the NW community. Aside from programmatic funding, you'll also find work for others. And Sandia does a lot of this. This is funding that's external to the labs. It can come in from other government sources or even sometimes from industry partners. So you'll see acronyms like DOE BES, or Basic Energy Sciences, DOE EERE, which is Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. And at Sandia, California, we have FCTO, the Fuel Cell Technologies Office. So there's a wide array of acronyms for these different funding sources. And the last one that I'd like to cover that I think is really solid gold for a postdoc at a national lab is LDRD, Laboratory Directed Research and Development. This is internal money that the labs amass from taxes on other projects, and they disperse to projects that, at least at Sandia and I believe at the other sites, go through a competitive proposal process. And when you get funding, it can be, the projects vary in size from a couple $100K to a couple of $1 million. The time scales vary. But the key thing about LDRD is that they are focused on answering fundamental scientific questions that often projects that are funded by EERE or NW don't have the breadth of scope to cover. So LDRD really provides you an opportunity to, I'd say, get a little deeper understanding of a particular scientific technical question. The other great thing about LDRDs I've discovered is that the teams are often interdisciplinary. They're really multifaceted. At Sandia, we have a lot of LDRDs that are both, that have an experimental component and a computational component. It exposes you to a wide variety of people at the labs. You get to work with folks from other departments and just kind of expands your network and I think helps you to think more broadly about the impact of your research. So a couple other things I'd like to mention briefly. When you're thinking about being a postdoc at a national lab, you have to keep in mind that the national labs are national security laboratories, every single one of them. Certainly the 4 defense labs have as their mission stockpile stewardship. Some of the other labs may have energy security as a mission. And so if you are interested in supporting that mission, continuing on from being a stockpile stewardship fellow essentially to supporting one of the missions, then being a postdoc at a national lab is a great way to do that. And I will freely admit that that was one of my main reasons for wanting to be a postdoc at a national lab, was to support the stockpile stewardship mission. So that's a great reason to go to the national labs and to do high impact science. Along with that mission often comes questions of classification. I mention this only because when I started my postdoc, I was told that every postdoc's first job is to find their next job. So if you think your next job might be tenure track faculty, and you need to publish lots and lots of papers, and they all need to be external and peer reviewed, you may not want to work on a classified project. If, on the other hand, you are interested in staying in R&D at the labs and supporting the mission is something you're really keen to do, then working on some component of a classified project, if you have the right skill set to do that, can be a really rewarding experience. Again, just like working on an LDRD project, you get exposed to a totally different group of scientists and engineers, and that can really just kind of broaden your thinking on the impact of the national labs. And the last thing I want to mention is every realtor's best advice. The key to good real estate is location, location, location. So the national labs are scattered across the country, and that means that geography can be a part of your decision in choosing if and where you might want to be a postdoc at a national lab. So I'd like to tell you in a little bit more detail what I've done as a postdoc, but I'm going to couch it in terms of my experiences as an SSGF fellow, particularly with regard to my practicum. So I started my PhD at Washington State University. I had the opportunity to go to Sandia, California to do some summer research. It was actually there that I found my practicum supervisor. I discovered that Sandia had this great program to do hydrogen effects on materials, which was something I was really interested in, but was not a part of my thesis research. So I plopped myself down in Brian Summerday's office and asked him if he'd be willing to be my practicum supervisor so that we could tackle a problem that was mutually beneficial to both of us. He was up for that challenge, and so I had my practicum settled. But before I did my practicum, I switched universities because my advisor moved halfway through my PhD to Purdue. Shortly after I moved to Purdue, I skedaddled back to California and did my first practicum with Brian in the hydrogen effects on materials team. So a couple things happened as a result of this practicum. Probably the most important for this talk is that at the conclusion of that practicum, Brian told me that he had been a part of an LDRD proposal team that had successfully been funded to do a project looking at multi-resolution characterization and prediction of environmentally assisted fracture. And he asked me if I would be interested in coming back to Sandia as a postdoc to work with him on that project. That was something that I was very interested in, and fortunately I had a little bit of time to make the decision and to kind of set that up. So as a result of my practicum, I found my postdoc. So keep that in mind. Practicums are a great way to find a postdoc position. Secondly, I liked my first practicum so much that I signed up to do another one. This time I actually did it at both Sandia facilities, Sandia Albuquerque and Sandia Livermore. It was a little more closely related to my thesis research. Another thing that came out of my first practicum was an international collaboration with a professor at the University of Aalto in Finland, where I was privileged to go do some research, again, on hydrogen effects on local deformation at Aalto. So shortly after I kind of finished all these different collaborations, I defended, PhD was over, I moved back to California yet again to start my postdoc, and of course that's where I find myself today. So one of the things you may have noticed from that previous slide is that as part of my PhD, I started to really get interested in collaborative research. I have decided that collaborations are one of the best ways to do research because I will never be an expert in all the experiments that I want to conduct, but someone else is, and they will probably be willing to work together to answer a bigger question. So fortunately for me, my postdoc, the LDRD that I am at least partially funded by, had a collaboration automatically built in. We were having some material processing done across the street at Lawrence Livermore. I set up yet another collaboration with Sandia Albuquerque to run some sonic velocity measurements of hydrogen-exposed nickel single crystals. And then as a result of some discussions with a colleague at Lawrence Livermore, I set up a collaboration with the Dynamic Materials Characterization Group at Drexel University, where I got to go do some high-resolution transmission electron microscopy of hydrogen-exposed structural metals. And then was able to go back to Aalto University yet again to do some follow-on research. And since Sandia had kindly paid for my international flight, they also paid for me to go to an international conference in Poland to present the results of those tests that I had done in Finland. And then I was able to give an invited seminar at the University of Leoben in Austria. So just a plug here for collaborators. They're a great way to wrangle yourself an invited talk, which we all know look great on CVs. So again, one of the many fruitful outcomes of collaborations. So this is where things really get interesting for me. In March of this year, my postdoc advisor, Brian Summerday, left Sandia National Labs. So this is now the second time I've been abandoned halfway through my tenure somewhere. I swear that doesn't say anything about me. So Brian went to Southwest Research Institute, and that kind of changed the shape of my postdoc a little bit. So Brian and I had been working on an enhanced surveillance project in direct support of some GTS interests, and I became the de facto PI on that project as a postdoc. Brian had groomed me to be the technical lead on that project, and so I took over in his shoes. I hear this is perhaps a little unusual for a postdoc to be a PI, but fortunately I've been mentored by some of the folks that I work with in GTS, by my manager, and also by the PI on the LDRD project I work on, who is just a phenomenal role model in that capacity. So I guess what I would say is that you never know what a national lab postdoc might hold. Be prepared for anything. You can really grow a lot as a scientist during your postdoc. And I mentioned that I really like collaboration. So Brian and I have continued to collaborate, and we in fact set up a collaboration with a former professor of mine at Colorado School of Mines. Ironically, my husband, who's also a mines grad and works in the same group that I work in, we're both collaborating on this project. So once again, you can really meet a lot of people as a postdoc at a national lab, set up many collaborations. You can grow in both breadth and depth of knowledge, depending on what you're interested in doing. And so since I'm kind of looking at finishing up my postdoc shortly, I think one of the most important questions to ask yourself as a postdoc is, what does success look like? And this will be a little different for every person, but the way I like to think about it is in terms of self-assessment. So I'm not going to read these questions to you, because you're all capable of reading, but I will say that if you can answer these questions, I think that means that you've been successful as a postdoc. And really, I think the crux of it is if you are ready to take on the responsibilities of a PI, you've had a very successful postdoc. It may not necessarily mean you've published 100 papers, but if you have grown as a scientist and a leader and are ready to move on to your next step, whatever that may be, then you've had a successful postdoc and you've really made a contribution to the labs. So I will stop talking there. I can take questions now, or I can hand it off to Rick and we can. All right. Sounds good.